By the time the first wave of Joe Rogan's comments had fully circulated through the internet, the reaction wasn't just digital noise anymore. It had become a cultural aftershock. What began as a single long-form podcast segment quickly turned into something much larger, a feedback loop of speculation, reaction videos, breakdown threads, and analysis of the analysis. In less than 72 hours, the so-called Rogan echo effect had formed, a phenomenon where a single narrative, once introduced into his platform, multiplies across the internet with no central control. For the Sussex camp, this was the part they had always feared most, not the original statement, but the way it spreads when it leaves its source. Inside Montecito, sources described a tense recalibration. The usual PR rhythm, delay, deny, redirect, wasn't working the same way anymore. The issue wasn't legal. It wasn't even reputational in the traditional sense. It was momentum. Every time the team tried to close one angle, 3 more opened somewhere else online. And at the center of it all was a simple problem. Rogan hadn't presented a conclusion. He had presented questions. Questions are harder to kill than statements. The new media physics by 2026, media no longer behaved like a pipeline. It behaved like a fluid system. Once a narrative entered the ecosystem, it didn't flow downward from press to audience. It moved sideways through creators, commentators, and algorithmic amplification. Rogan understood this better than most traditional journalists because he never played by their rules. He didn't need verification chains or editorial consensus. He only needed curiosity and a microphone. And once curiosity becomes contagious, it stops belonging to any one person. That's what made this moment different. The Sussex narrative had survived criticism before. It had survived tabloid cycles, documentary backlash, even political commentary. But those were all contained environments: Britain, Hollywood, mainstream press. Rogan's reach didn't sit in one ecosystem. It sat in all of them at once. The unanswered space, what made the situation particularly volatile, wasn't what was said. It was what wasn't resolved. In traditional media disputes, there is usually a closure point: a denial, a lawsuit, an official statement, or a controlled interview. But Rogan's framing created something that journalists began calling the unanswered space. That space is dangerous because it allows the audience to fill in its own narrative. Once that happens, control shifts from the speaker to the listener. And in this case, millions of listeners were now actively reconstructing timelines, relationships, and coincidences, not from confirmed evidence, but from perceived gaps. Some described it as investigation. Others described it as imagination. The difference no longer mattered online. Montecito's internal crisis loop inside the Sussex orbit, the problem wasn't panic, it was fragmentation. One group of advisors pushed for silence, arguing that engagement would only amplify the cycle. Another group pushed for clarification, suggesting that ambiguity was allowing speculation to harden into perceived fact. A third group, smaller but influential, argued something more uncomfortable: that the audience had already moved emotionally past the brand. Not rejected it, just stopped needing it. That distinction mattered, because rejection still creates engagement. Indifference creates disappearance, and disappearance is far harder to reverse. The Australia data shock, then came the analytics from the Australian tour. While public appearances had been carefully staged and ticketed as empowerment events, internal reports painted a more complicated picture. Engagement was high, but sentiment was unstable. Search trends spiked around unrelated keywords: Rogan Meghan clip, yacht rumors timeline, Soho House connections explained. Even attendees who had come for lifestyle messaging were, according to post-event surveys, preoccupied with external narratives. The key insight was not hostility, it was distraction. The audience was physically present, but cognitively elsewhere. That is a worst-case scenario for any public-facing brand. The narrative collision. At the same time, commentators outside the Sussex orbit began describing what they called a narrative collision event. This happens when two competing story frameworks occupy the same cultural moment. One framework, curated reinvention, lifestyle branding, personal healing narratives. The other framework, investigative skepticism, timeline reconstruction, and network mapping. When these two frameworks overlap, neither can fully dominate. Instead, they grind against each other, producing constant reinterpretation of every past event. A gesture becomes evidence, a silence becomes implication, a coincidence becomes structure. And in that environment, nothing remains neutral. The fragility of reinvention for Meghan's public image strategy: reinvention had always been the central thesis. Reinvention requires one essential condition: audience reset. A reset doesn't mean forgetting the past, it means deprioritizing it. But Rogan's intervention disrupted that mechanism. Instead of allowing the past to fade, it re-indexed it. Old stories were no longer archived. They were resurfaced, recontextualized, and re-argued. In media terms, this is called temporal collapse. When past events lose their distance and feel newly active again, that collapse is what makes reinvention unstable. You can't rebuild an identity if the foundation keeps reappearing in the feed. The first signs of fatigue. By the end of the first week, something subtle began to change in the broader audience response. Not outrage, not defense, fatigue. Comment sections stopped arguing as intensely. Reaction videos became shorter. Headlines became less sensational. But this wasn't resolution, it was saturation. And saturation has its own danger. It turns attention into boredom, and boredom into disengagement. For any media-driven brand, disengagement is more threatening than controversy. Because controversy keeps you alive, boredom lets you disappear. At Montecito, one advisor reportedly summarized the situation in a single line during a closed meeting. This isn't a scandal cycle anymore. It's an attention drift, and nobody in the room contradicted him, because everyone understood what that meant. The story wasn't escalating, it was spreading thin, mapping the entire timeline. By mid-2026, the conversation had shifted again. What began as a debate about a podcast had evolved into something far more intricate, a sprawling attempt to map relationships, introductions, and overlapping social circles across 2 decades. And at the center of that map, one name kept appearing again and again: Soho House. To supporters of the official narrative, Soho House was simply a private members club, a backdrop for celebrity culture, industry networking, and curated socializing. But to a growing group of online investigators, commentators, and amateur archivists, it had become something else entirely: a node system. Not a place, a mechanism. The architecture of Access the Theory, as it began circulating online, was not that Soho House controlled events, but that it structured proximity. In this interpretation, influence was not exercised through direct action, but through introduction density. Who meets whom, when, and under what conditions of privacy. The key figure in this reconstructed network was Marcus Anderson, not as a celebrity or public personality, but as what online analysts began calling an access broker. In this framing, his role was not social, it was logistical. He did not create relationships, he positioned them. And positioning in elite ecosystems is often indistinguishable from power. The invisible timeline theory. As 2026 progressed, a new kind of analysis emerged across long-form video platforms and investigative threads. The invisible timeline theory. It proposed that public-facing narratives, interviews, biographies, documentaries, represented only the final layer of a much older sequence of interactions. According to this model, relationships that appear sudden or organic are often preceded by years of indirect proximity, shared events, mutual acquaintances, repeated spatial overlap. So when audiences looked at the widely accepted version of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's meeting in 2016, some began to ask whether that moment was truly a beginning, or simply the point at which an existing network became visible. Not proven, not disproven, just reinterpreted. And in the digital age, reinterpretation is often enough. The power of the unrecorded room, Soho House's defining feature, and its greatest source of speculation, is not what happens inside it, but what is not documented. No public photography policies. No open guest lists, no transparent archival record. To mainstream culture, this is simply privacy, but to online analysts it represents something more structurally significant, a gap in the data. And gaps in an era of overexposure become magnets for projection. One commentator described it as a social environment optimized for memory without evidence. Whether accurate or not, the phrase spread rapidly. Because it captured something intuitive, even if it didn't capture something factual. The network effect. By this stage in the narrative cycle, individual names were no longer being discussed in isolation. They were being plotted. Digital relationship maps began circulating, showing lines between actors, producers, investors, and media figures, all intersecting at private events, hospitality venues, or creative retreats. What made these diagrams compelling was not their accuracy, but their symmetry. Humans are pattern-seeking organisms. And Soho House, with its repeated presence in elite cultural stories, became the perfect geometric center for those patterns. In these reconstructions, no meeting was accidental. No introduction was neutral. No proximity was meaningless. Everything became directional. The problem of overconnection. As the mapping intensified, something unexpected happened. The network didn't clarify the story. It complicated it. The more connections were drawn, the more ambiguous causality became. Did person A influence person B? Or did they simply occupy the same social gravity well? Was proximity evidence of coordination or just class convergence? Sociologists studying digital rumor ecosystems refer to this stage as overconnection collapse, where too many links weaken the credibility of all links. Because when everything is connected, nothing stands out as meaningful anymore. The media response gap traditional media, observing the growing online discourse, found itself in an unusual position. The claims being circulated were not easily addressable. They were not singular allegations that could be confirmed or denied. They were structural interpretations, frameworks rather than facts. And frameworks are resistant to debunking. You cannot fact-check a perception model. You can only challenge the assumptions behind it, and that requires engagement with the narrative itself, which risks amplifying it further. So mainstream outlets largely avoided direct confrontation with the Soho House discourse. And in that silence, the digital narrative expanded to fill the space. The reinvention paradox for the Sussex brand narrative, already under strain from earlier controversies in this timeline. This created a secondary problem. Reinvention relies on linear storytelling, then potential transformation now. But network-based narratives are nonlinear. They suggest continuity instead of change. Not a break from the past, but an extension of it. That is why the Soho House framework proved so disruptive within the fictionalized media ecosystem of this story. It did not argue that reinvention was impossible. It argued that reinvention might not be the correct description of what occurred in the first place. The emotional undercurrent beneath all the structural analysis, however, there was a more human layer to the discourse, one that rarely made it into the diagrams or threads. For many observers, the fascination was not really about networks, clubs, or introductions. It was about certainty. People were trying to locate certainty in a narrative that had become emotionally fragmented over time. And Soho House, with its controlled environments and elite associations, became a symbolic anchor point, a place where ambiguity could be concentrated into something that felt diagrammable. In other words, if you can map it, you can understand it. And if you can understand it, it feels less chaotic. The limits of mapping, but even within the most detailed reconstructions, a recurring problem emerged. Every map ended in speculation. Every line eventually led to a question mark. And every question mark led to disagreement. Because the underlying issue was not lack of information, it was excess interpretation. By 2026, the audience no longer lacked data. It lacked agreement on what data meant. The closing shift as the Soho House discourse reached its peak intensity online, engagement began to subtly shift again. Not away from the topic, but away from certainty itself. People stopped asking, "What happened?" and started asking, "Does it matter if we can't agree on what happened?" That question marked a turning point, because it suggested the story was no longer about discovery, it was about exhaustion. And exhaustion, unlike controversy, does not need resolution, it simply fades. By the end of Chapter 2, the narrative had expanded far beyond any single person or event. It had become a system of interpretation, a web that reflected back whatever meaning people brought into it. And somewhere inside that web, the original story was still there. But it was getting harder to see where it began.